Good morning, Cornerstone. Well, we do have a lot to cover today, even though it's a short text. Everybody grab your life jackets. We're going to jump in the boat together. Let me say a word of prayer before we go on. Thank you, Father, Son, and Spirit, for your gift of life and gift of breath, the gift of joy and laughter and smiles. And thank you for the gift of your presence. When the smiles fade and the laughter turns to crying, you are with us. Thank you for your presence. And we know your presence is here even now. In Jesus' name, amen. Have you ever doubted your faith? Maybe you've asked yourself, why do I have so little faith? Maybe you question why in a particular season of your life or situation you found yourself in. You're asking, why is my faith waning at this moment? Why is it limping and fading and shrinking from the moment? Have you ever doubted your faith? That faith at that time, that seems to be destabilizing. What is it in? What is your faith in? What is our faith in? What is your faith in or about? Are you losing faith in yourself? That happens a lot. Anybody ever lose faith in yourself? I have. Is it faith in your belief in God that seems to be a bit shallow sometimes? Is it faith in God that this situation will work out or won't it work out? Your prayers will be answered or will they not be answered? This thing will go okay or it's going to fall flat. Maybe there's times in your life that you think that God is asleep at the wheel. Or maybe for today's context, asleep at the rudder in the stern of the boat. Do you ever feel like Jesus is taking a nap in your life? Things are swirling around you and you're getting pummeled by the waves, buffeted by the wind, soaked and drenched from the sea waters of an insane world. We know that God is aware of our faith level, probably even more than ourselves. And it's one thing for you to question your own faith, but can you imagine God saying to you, "Oh, you of little faith"? Or even more brutal, "Do you still have no faith?" That would be a zinger, wouldn't it? It would be like, oh, you cut me deep, Shrek. You cut me deep, real deep just now. If you've ever seen Shrek, you know that movie or you know that line. You cut me deep. God, you cut me deep. No faith. I know my faith isn't what it's supposed to be, but no faith. In today's text, we have Jesus saying just that to his disciples. Do you still have no faith? As we read the story, we might find ourselves saying, but the disciples have a good reason for their faith to be a little rocky and shaken. Not only is their faith taking a back seat, they're afraid too. Their fear is outweighing their faith. And we would be afraid too, I think, most likely, given their situation. Sometimes I know when I read the text and in all the articles and the research I've done, a lot of writers say the same thing. They understand why the disciples might be afraid. Jesus, go easy on them. There's a storm, and we're going to see how big the storm was. It was not only a squall, but a ferocious squall. Jesus, go easy on them. They don't know any better. And it's true. At that point, they didn't know any better. And they didn't really know who he, Jesus, really was either. Let's read our text for today. It's in Mark 4. Mark 4, verses 35 through 31. You can find the parallel text in Matthew 8 if you want to read that later. It's a little bit different, but not much. Today we're in Mark 4. That day, anybody have a question? What day? What day? See, this is where I get into trouble. I hadn't planned on setting it up like this. But now that you've asked the question, what day? Well, I got to answer it. Well, this text follows right on the heels of when Jesus is coming down to the Sea of Galilee. Some call it the Sea of Tiberias. Gennesaret, I believe, is also a name. Throughout time, the name kind of changes and ebbs and flows. But this, most of us know it today, is the Sea of Galilee. He's coming to the Sea of Galilee, and there's a lot of people following him. There's a crowd. He's already healed people, forgiven people, which, of course, only God can do. So, forgiven people of their sins. You are forgiven, and that, let's follow this guy. So there's a whole lot of people around, and he still is teaching, and he wants to be able to teach the people, and in order for him to get a little space from the people and for everybody to hear, he gets into a boat. Gets into a boat and begins teaching in parables. So it's that day. He's already in a boat. He's already in the boat teaching. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side. Not to the other side of the boat, but to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And we'll see where they're going to go in a little bit. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. And so on the way, this is in the evening, it's getting dark. Along the way to where they're going, to the other side, a furious squall came up. And the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern sleeping, taking a nap on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now leave it here, David, before we finish the text. A furious squall, taking a nap, and other boats. Sounds like a good sermon title. A squall, a nap, and other boats. There were also other boats with them. Next slide. He got up and rebuked the waves. Wait, go back one. Did I miss something? Hang on a second here. Yes, okay. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher." So all of this is going on, right? Long day, such a long day. Jesus is taking a nap. And in the midst of this storm, this furious squall, he is sleeping. I find it interesting. It says he's in the stern. What's in the stern? What's at the stern of the boat? Typically, the rudder. He's where the person is supposed to be steering the boat. He's there sleeping. He's asleep at the wheel. He's asleep at the rudder. Now, one of the commentators I read said that the translation of cushion isn't really a cushion; it's a hard sandbag. But I read more and more and more, and so many of the translations say cushion. I'm sure they had something soft. Have you ever been in a small boat? So this boat, the fishing boats on the Sea of Galilee, aren't huge, maybe 25 feet long, 7 feet wide, just enough for 12 or 15 people. So it's not big. Have you ever taken a boat like that out on either Mission Bay or out in San Diego, and they're not comfortable. And it's hard to even sit, let alone sleep. But here is Jesus sleeping. He is human after all. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" So it was getting that bad. The Matthew account says, we're going to perish. We're going to die. Don't you care if we drown? That's important. We'll look at that in just a bit as well. Next slide. We'll finish it up. Not the sermon, just the text. Don't get excited. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet!" Or he doesn't have to yell, does he? He's, chill out, wind and waves. Quiet. Be still. Be still. It's chaotic, isn't it? In this furious squall. In Matthew, it says water was coming into the boat already up to their ankles. So the boat was already getting filled with water. Waves are coming. And so on the Sea of Galilee, I don't have a map, but the Sea of Galilee it's north of Jerusalem. The Jordan River flows into the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. And the Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater lake on earth, at 700 feet below sea level. The Jordan River continues down into the Dead Sea, the lowest saltwater body on earth. And not just the lowest saltwater body on earth, it's the lowest point on earth, at almost twice the negative elevation of the Sea of Galilee at 700 feet below sea level. The Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level. Just a little geography for you. So the Sea of Galilee sits way, way down, and on both sides there are mountains. The biblical text calls them mountains. When we think of mountains, we may think of the Rocky Mountains or some other mountain range way above the 1,500 feet. So on the east side of the Sea of Galilee is a mountain range, the Golan Heights, and from there heading eastward, it just goes out into the desert. On the west side of the Sea of Galilee is another little range of hills or mountains, about 1,500 feet elevation, and it goes westward to the Mediterranean Sea. So what would happen on the Sea of Galilee is you would have cool wind coming from the Mediterranean and whoosh, swoop down into the Sea of Galilee. Then you would have hot winds from the Golan Heights, from the desert, coming in whoosh, down into the Sea of Galilee. And what do you think happens when they meet? A storm. A storm. And it could happen quite suddenly, quite quickly, quite ferociously, if you will. So he got up and he rebuked this wind and the waves. Quiet, be still. This chaotic situation. The translation, peace, be still, in a way sanitizes it a little bit, because it's more like Jesus waking up and telling the winds to shut up. The Greek translation of the word. It's a strong, one writer says it's a strong, vulgar verb in the Greek. Shut your yap. Muzzle it. Wind and waves, muzzle yourselves. Shut up. Jesus muzzles the wind with the same authoritative language that is used when he silences demons. Jesus puts a gag order on the wind. And he says to his disciples, after that, what happened? It was completely calm. The wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this?" The Matthew account, it kind of gives it a little bit of a juxtaposition. It kind of gives the sense that they were afraid of the wind and the waves, but this terminology, they were terrified. They were very afraid. So they were afraid before, and now that it's all still, watching Jesus do this, now they're very afraid, terrified. Now the translation of this word terrified, it's a little bit more, they were in awe, reverence. You know, a lot of times it talks about the fear of the Lord. It doesn't mean shaking in your boots, scared that he's going to do something bad to you. It's this fear, this awe, this reverence, this respect. But just like they didn't know what to do with the winds and the waves, they don't know what to do now that Jesus has calmed it. Who is this? Matthew says, "What kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." River, could you do me a favor? Can you shut the front door? You did, but it needs to go click. Otherwise, the wind will blow it in. No problem. No problem. As Ann says, we don't want to cool the outside. I don't know if you can cool the outside, but if you leave the door open with the air conditioner on, the air conditioner has to work harder. And then there were sirens going on out there. A little bit of chaos. A little bit of wind and waves. Quiet. Be still. River! Shut the door. Thank you. Thank you, River. Appreciate that. Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Next slide. I think I have a picture of one of the most famous depictions of this. This is Rembrandt's painting, one of his most astonishing works, his only seascape, I read somewhere. Christ in the storm on the Sea of Galilee. I read that it was stolen from a museum in 1990, and they still haven't found it. But you can Google that. Fact check me. But look at this. Look at this depiction. I mean, whoa, Nelly. Who would be afraid? Now, come on. I would be afraid. I feel for the disciples. Nadia Bolz-Weber, from an article in the Christian Century magazine, I think she wrote in 2018, she says this, "I feel for the disciples when they wake him. They're understandably angry that he doesn't seem to care that they're going to die." I mean, look at this. I'd be just as angry, upset, scared at Jesus for appearing so calm in the midst of real danger. The disciples are uncomfortable that Jesus is not acting according to the category of concerned friend, much less Messiah. So they kind of yell at him, "We're drowning, we're going to perish. Don't you care about us?" She continues, "And when it comes down to it, who hasn't yelled at God during their storms of life? Who hasn't said, or at least thought, even if just for a little moment, God, don't you care? Because things aren't going the way we want them to. Who hasn't experienced death or isolation or chaos or anxiety or just simple, raw human pain and not felt that God was, by all appearances, lazily sleeping through it? Sure, if God cared about me, God would change my life circumstances to suit my preferences, or maybe God could have kept the tragic, painful thing from happening in the first place. When we are fearful or angry, we feel as though God has abandoned us, or at least fallen asleep on a comfy cushion. When storms arise and people die and we suffer and our friends abandon us, we assume God has fallen down on the job again. We don't trust his character. I mean, being fearful while in a storm at sea is not exactly an irrational fear, is it? Nadia continues, as human beings, we are wired for certain responses when our lives are in danger. Adrenaline is released in our brains, and our heart rate increases, our pupils dilate, and we become hyper aware of what's happening around us. We don't exactly choose to react that way, it's just happens. In the midst of that, Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves and turns to his disciples and says, where is your faith? Or why do you still have no faith? It's almost like an accusation. Is Jesus trying to tell his disciples, trying to tell us that we should never be afraid? That we lack faith, that we have no faith if we have normal anxiety or worry or fear? Is that what he's trying to tell us? Have you ever had a moment of fear where you thought you might die? Or maybe you knew you probably wouldn't die, but it sure felt like it. I mean, I have a couple of experiences like that I'll share with you. Have you ever felt like you're going to die? Like I said, the Matthew account in Matthew 8 says, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. We are going to perish. We're going to die, man. Next slide. I have two photos here of some carnivals, some fairs call it the zipper. I haven't been to the Del Mar Fair. I think only once, maybe twice since we lived here. It's really on only for a short time. It starts mid-June and then ends July 4th, I think is the last day. Is it 2 weeks? Is that what you said, Lee? 2 or 3 weeks at the most. And you can only eat so many fried pickles, fried Twinkies, and fried everything else anyway. But one time we went, and I was with Camden, and we went up in the zipper, and I will never, ever ride a ride. I like roller coasters. I can handle that. But this thing, I thought I was going to die. After all, it's a temporary structure. They bring it in from who knows where and set it up. In these little pods, there's room for 2 or 3 people, and when that thing spins around, the individual pods tumble, and I was holding on for dear life. And being the dad, the father, I didn't want to seem too freaked out because across from me is Camden. He was young at the time. And I just kept saying, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And he was probably like, Dad, what? I was waiting for him to say, have you no faith? What's going on? I can't remember the look on his face because I was just freaking out. I thought I was going to die. But it's a natural fear. We weren't belted in and we were clanging around inside that thing like you're inside of a dryer or a cement mixer or whatever. Another time, I thought I was going to die, or at least I was afraid somebody around was going to die. It's a place called Queen's Bath in Kauai, Hawaii. Now, look at this, friends. This is like the sea after Jesus calms it. I mean, this is tranquil. They call it Queen's Bath. How much of a furious squall can you have in a bath? It's called the Queen's Bath. Well, it doesn't stay this way. And there's a place up on the rocks. You can jump from way high or climb down about halfway and jump into this nice, wonderful, protected pool of water. One description is, this idyllic tide pool was once a bathing spot for Hawaiian royalty. But that doesn't mean it's void of all negativity. With rough waters, sharp rocks, and ever-changing ocean conditions, this Kauai gem is an accident or a drowning waiting to happen. Next slide. So there's this plaque, and I remember seeing this plaque. This isn't my picture. I didn't have time to go through all of our photos and find them and pull up stuff. Queen's Bath drownings, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Yeah, 29. Is that 29? 29 people have died in that tranquil pool that isn't so tranquil all the time. Unexpected large waves will knock you off the rocks and sweep you out to sea. Next slide. This is what it can look like. Typically, at certain times of the day, right, high tide, you want to stay away from the Queen's Bath. But even during some tranquil times, you can get rogue waves or a shift or whatever in the waves, and it just comes piling in. So we had jumped into the tranquil pool, and it was starting to get a bit foamy, and then the waves came in, and we were clinging to the sides of the rocks for dear life. Because when those waves come in, what do waves do after they come in? They crash, and then they go out with people. Next slide. So this is another view of it. It's just foamy. It's tumultuous. It's crazy. And we experience that. The waves just pushing us back into the lava rocks that can cut you and hurt you. Next slide, real quick. So this is kind of a high overview. You can see in the bit of the lower left the tranquil pool. This must be at low tide, and you can see that little curved channel where waves can come in not only into the pool, but along the backside in through that channel. And my sister was sitting, if you can see just at the bend, kind of the high point, she was sitting on rocks there when those rogue waves came in. And a wave came in from that backside and washed her halfway down that channel. Next slide. So this is a picture of that channel. The previous one, it didn't look like there was any water in it, but this is what it looks like as well. Not as bad as it was that day, but I thought for sure Jennifer was gone, my younger sister. We do have video of that actually happening, but we didn't get a chance to pull it up. If you want to Google on YouTube, Queen's Bath Rogue Wave 2018, it's not our video, but it's a short little 2-minute video of a guy jumping into the tranquil pool, and 1 minute later, have you ever thought you were going to die? Some people call the Queen's Bath the pool of death. Was Jesus' accusation of no faith a knock on their normal fear of the situation? Did they have no faith because of their fear? Jesus, you better wake up, but we're not going to get out of this one. Is Jesus suggesting that we should never fear, or that what we would call normal fears or normal being afraid, that we should just not ever have that? Because he'll always get us out. He'll always prevent trouble, trial, or tribulation. That nothing bad will ever happen to us or our loved ones? Or is there something else going on here? Something else that they didn't have faith in? We'll take a look at that. But first, the disciples ask a question at the end of the text. In Mark's account, it says that they were terrified and asked each other. I'm sure Jesus heard. It's not a big boat. They were all right there trying to wake him up. After he calms the storm, it's all quiet now. You could hear a pin drop. Who is this? They asked each other. Even the wind and the waves obey him. In the Matthew account, in Matthew 8:27, the men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. The very act of commanding the elements, controlling the weather, telling the wind and the water what to do, is in a sense an answer to that question. But they asked the question after it happened, who in the world is this? They've already seen miracles, healings. It's early on in Jesus' ministry. This is Mark 4, which is early on in the book. And he does other miracles and the resurrection of Lazarus and all kinds of stuff. And even after this account, there's another miracle, something that shows who he is. But even after the forgiving of sins of people and healing people and all that he's done, he has not yet fed the 5,000 or the 4,000, that miracle. But that wasn't enough for the disciples. But when this happens, when he controls the wind and the waves, when he controls the weather, commanding the elements, this is when they go, who in the world is this? Can you think of another event, perhaps earlier in the biblical narrative, where God controlled the wind and the water? At creation, yes. Yeah. I almost included that because... Oh, I almost included that. But I included one other one. Let's go to Exodus 13:17. The text is not on here. I'm going to read right through it. You can read Exodus 13 and 14. Some of you are very familiar with the story of when the Israelites are let go out of Egypt. Pharaoh finally acquiesces after the 10 plagues to let, as Moses says, let my people go. Pharaoh finally let the people go, and they leave Egypt. When Pharaoh let the people go in Exodus 13:17, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter, for God said if they go that way, they're going to face war, and they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So they didn't go that way. God didn't want his people, these slaves, who weren't treated very well. Can you imagine them going to war? So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. Exodus 14, then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-Zephon. And when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. The way that reads, it's like losing your handyman. It's more than that. He didn't just lose the services of a handyman. He left his work force, his labor force for building his temples and the pyramids and the palaces. So he had his chariot made ready, and he took his army with him. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-Hahiroth, opposite Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked on, and there were the Egyptians marching after them, and they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us here in the desert to die? Because they're on the shore of the Red Sea. There is no bridge. There is no tunnel. They can't go that way, and here comes the Egyptian army. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? That's just a whole nother story, a whole nother sermon. What? You're in slavery. You told Moses, leave us alone. We like it here. Let us serve it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. It's interesting. Jesus tells the wind and the waves, quiet, be still, but peace, be still. I wonder if he wasn't telling his disciples that as well. It's interesting. The wind and the waves heard and obeyed. Maybe the disciples didn't. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left, controlling the elements, the wind and the water. The Egyptians pursued them, and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea on the dry land. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. And Moses did that. The water flowed back and covered the chariots, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared, were in awe, reverence. But this is one of their first interactions with him. Maybe they were afraid. But they put their trust in him and in Moses' servant. This is one of Israel's foundation stories, their liberating moment. And this event has been remembered and celebrated for thousands of years, still to this day. Any Jewish person at the time of Jesus would know that God has power, authority, and command over the wind and the sea. Biblical writers use the metaphor of wind and water to describe not only God's power, but also personal experiences. Let's look at a couple of those. What do I have first, David? Next slide. Psalm 69, 1 through 4. So this is the psalmist talking about how people are after him, attacking him, his enemies, and how he feels. And he says, save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths where there is no foothold. I've come into the deep waters, and the floods engulf me. The Jewish people of Jesus' time, they know this psalm. They have in their heads what wind and water means, metaphorically and really. These were fishermen. They had experienced storms before, and they certainly knew the Exodus story, the power and might of God to part the waters, to have command over the wind and the waves. I am worn out, calling for help. My throat is parched, my eyes fail, looking for my God. Those who hate me without reason outnumber the hairs of my head. I don't have too many who hate me without reason, because I don't have very many hairs on my head, but the psalmist did. Many are my enemies without cause, those who seek to destroy me. So he's going through this inner turmoil and external threat, and he uses the imagery of wind and water, chaotic, tumultuous, furious squall. Next slide. And so that's a personal experience. And then to describe God's might and power, the psalmist says this: some went out on the sea in ships, and they were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep, for he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waters. God again commanding the elements. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Next slide. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and for his wonderful deeds for mankind. One more. Psalm 69. Nope, Psalm 89. Psalm 89. We already did Psalm 69. Who is like you, Lord God Almighty? You, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount out, you still them. So the disciples had seen miracles, Jesus in action. And they know this about God, and they see the two conflate, is that the right word? Come together, and they still don't get it. They ask, who is this man? For the Jews, the people to whom Jesus comes, their great creator God is the one who can still the raging sea. He is the God who quells the chaos, quells the squalls. Now here is Jesus doing what only God, the Creator, could possibly do, addressing the elements and literally putting them in their place. He couldn't make his identity much clearer. Here on the lake, as the darkness draws in, and with the disciples as his audience, along with other boats, I might add, Jesus reveals himself as the true God, nothing less than God in the form of man. What kind of man is this? It is God. Could it be any plainer than that? Next slide. So they asked this question. Actually, yeah, stay here. So they asked the question, what kind of man is this? Who is this? Jesus doesn't answer. Even if they're asking the question to each other, he doesn't go, I have a clue. Do you want to know? He doesn't say anything. Instead, after the storm and the calmness, they went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit, an evil spirit, a demon, if you will, from the tombs to meet him. He lived in a cemetery. From the tombs. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" This happens right after the disciples' question, who is this? What kind of man is this? This is the answer to the question in demonstrative form. It's interesting. The man with the evil spirit knew God was walking to him from afar off. He saw Jesus from afar off and went to him and got on his knees and says, Jesus, Son of the God Most High. And yet the disciples, with Jesus right there in the boat with them, didn't know. There's a story in Matthew 8 before all of this takes place. And it's the story of the faith of the centurion. And I don't read it, but Jesus is saying, why do you still have no faith? O you of little faith. But I want to make the transition between what kind of man is this? Who is this? It's God in human form. to what probably the disciples didn't have faith in. We have the centurion who hears about Jesus, and he comes to Jesus to ask for help. Now, this is a Roman centurion, right? A symbol of the Roman Empire, the Roman empirical might and oppression and power. Not friends of the Jewish people. But he comes to Jesus and says, Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. And Jesus said, shall I come to heal him? And first of all, here is Jesus who's going to heal the enemy. And not just the enemy, a servant of the enemy, a servant, a nobody, a servant of the enemy, of the oppressor. Jesus doesn't hesitate. Shall I come and heal him? And the centurion replied, Lord, I don't deserve to have you come under my roof. But just say the word, and my servants will be healed. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. This enemy of Jesus, I guess, if you will, of the Jewish people, the oppressor, this military man, knows who Jesus is. He knows the character of Jesus. And he seems to know the power and the authority of Jesus because he says, Jesus, you don't even need to lift a finger. You don't need to take one step toward my home. You just say the word and my servant will be healed. Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And the servant was healed at that moment. And so for the centurion, it's not just faith or hope that God can heal the servant. It's faith in who Jesus is. He is God. And we can see that the centurion had in mind that Jesus would care about his servant. Why even bother to ask one of your subjects to do this if you didn't think he didn't care? This Roman centurion, the symbol of war and might and oppression, a representative of the Roman Empire where Caesar is Lord, wants his servant to be healed. He seems to know something about Jesus' character. As a side note, this brings me to the other boats. It says in our text that there were other boats. It's not mentioned again, right? The story focuses on the boat that the disciples are in with Jesus. But there was a little armada, a flotilla, if you will, of boats with Jesus going to the other side. And their boats were caught in the storm too. Were they Galileans, Gentiles, followers of Jesus, an overflow of disciples, looky-loos? But they too experienced the goodness and the godness of Jesus. The sea was calm for them too. I would say that Jesus is also not just worried about us, but other boats. He healed the servant of a centurion. I think he cares. When we're in the midst of our storm, our squall, it's easy to get myopic. It's natural. To pull in, to shut out, and to be all consumed with our storm, our own storm. And that's fairly natural, but let's remember that there are also other boats. Other people all around us going through their own storms, and they need Jesus too. whether they're on our side or not. They need to know he cares about them, that he is in their boat too, whether they know it or not. Last thought. Yay, last thought. Last thought, folks. It's a long one. No, I'm just kidding. I think I have this last part of the text on the screen. And that's simply this. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" I don't think Jesus was upset that they were afraid. That's normal. That's natural. I think he was disappointed. I think he was upset that they lacked faith in his character. They lacked faith in who he was, whether he calmed the storm or not. They didn't think that he cared. He didn't think that he cared. Don't you care? Faith in his character is challenged. Faith is about believing in God, that God is God, that Jesus is God, that God is good regardless of what I'm going through, regardless of what you're going through. Faith is trusting his heart for us, that he does care. I don't think they were rebuked for being afraid or even waking him up. But this line, "Don't you care?" They didn't trust in his character. And maybe at this point they didn't know his character enough. But we do know the character of God. We know he has the power and authority to command the elements and to command the elements in our lives. But it's not always going to be quiet and still in our lives, is it? We could be afraid. But what should remain, what I hope remains for us, is our faith in the character of who Jesus is. I think this story is about claiming that Jesus is the embodiment of the one true God. That's who he is, and that he cares. May we know what kind of man Jesus is. He is God in human form. He perfectly reveals the Father, and he reveals the Father's heart. May we know that Jesus cares. No matter the winds or the waves, the rocking of the boat, the sinking feeling of doubt, or the flooding of fear, Jesus is with us, and he is God.